This is the first of a number of talks about the history of Enfield Chase, a former royal hunting ground, now countryside on the northern edge of London, but in past times a remote rural area a day's ride from the City of London and the main royal palaces. Today I want to provide a broad overview of the chase, including where it was and what it was. Subsequent talks will deal with hunting, forest law, poaching, the main events in the history of the chase, and the mysterious Enfield beast. This map illustrates the importance of hunting in Enfield Chase during the reign of King James I, who was a frequent visitor to the area. The map shows Middlesex and Hertfordshire, with Enfield Chase more or less in the centre. The chase is represented as the allegorical figure of Diana the huntress, holding a large bow and carrying a quiver of arrows next to the hunting woodland. At first glance, the map is a little confusing, and that's because rather than following the modern convention of putting north at the top, north is actually on the right. The River Thames follows the left-hand edge of the map, and the River Lee is shown running along the bottom. Interestingly, Enfield Chase is given equal or greater prominence than other centres such as St Albans and Hampstead and Highgate, denoting the importance of Enfield Chase in the mind of the engraver. The word chase comes from chasse, a French word meaning to hunt. A chase was a type of forest, a concept introduced to England by William the Conqueror and the Normans, and meaning an area of private hunting forest exclusively for the use of the monarch and his guests. Forest law was therefore outside the common law, and indeed the word forest derives from the Latin word foris, which means outside. The importance of the forest law within Enfield Chase will be covered in a later talk. Forests may or may not be characterised by trees, and some covered areas of moor and heathland. Enfield Chase, which, as we shall see, included large areas of grazing for animals, was probably similar to the wood pasture of the New Forest. The one thing that all forests had in common was the presence of plentiful deer, the favourite quarry of the Normans and their successors. Originally, the key difference between a chase and a royal forest was that a chase was a hunting ground gifted by the monarch to favoured barons. Indeed, Enfield Chase was gifted by King Stephen to the Baron Geoffrey de Mandeville in 1140, supposedly in exchange for his loyalty, although, as we'll see in a later talk, that didn't quite work out as planned. Later, however, the distinctions between royal forest and non-royal chase blurred as land changed hands, and this was exactly what happened with Enfield Chase. In 1399, Henry Bolingbroke became Henry IV after seizing the throne from Richard II, the last of the Plantagenet kings. One of Henry's titles was Duke of Lancaster, and with it came lands focused on Lancashire, but also dotted around the country as shown on this map. Henry, as Duke of Lancaster, acquired lands from a number of different sources, including the estates of Humphrey de Bohun, the Earl of Hereford and of Essex, and a major presence in the Middlesex area. And so in 1421 Enfield Chase passed to Henry and became a royal chase. As you can see here, Enfield Chase was unusual because it was the only hunting ground owned by the Duchy of Lancaster near London. Local residents will be aware of a number of streets that take their name from the Duchy of Lancaster, including in Hadley Wood and in the east of the area. Today, the Duchy of Lancaster continues to provide income to the monarchy, and the current Duke of Lancaster is better known as King Charles III. In the Enfield Chase area today, a number of modern street signs indicate the location of the historic chase. There are chase sides in both EN2 and the EN14 postcode areas. In Potter's Bar, Chase Avenue is spelt with a C rather than the more familiar S. Now have a look at this old map. In the title, Chase is also spelt with a C. The reason for the variation in spelling is that in the days before the introduction of the dictionary in the middle of the 18th century, spellings varied wildly, so the modern variation in spelling reflects this historic inconsistency. The map clearly shows the key features of the chase, including the small settlements of Potter's Bar, Hadley, and Enfield on the perimeter, although at this time South Gate was literally just a gate into the chase. At the centre of the chase is Camlet Moat, the old administrative centre of the chase that can still be seen within Trent Park today, and the South Lodge, East Lodge, and West Lodge, the administrative centres from the early 15th century onwards, of which only the later West Lodge now survives. By the time of this map, 3 large commons had been divided off from the chase for the adjoining parishes of Enfield, South Mimms, and Edmonton. Local residents might find the idea of Edmonton being in Southgate confusing, but in fact, at the time of this map, the parish of Edmonton extended in a wide band across the northern part of Middlesex. The whole of the chase lay within the old hundred of Edmonton, a much older and larger administrative area. The diarist John Evelyn visited Sir Henry Coventry at his home at South Lodge in Enfield Chase on the 2nd of June 1676. Evelyn's diary records the following words: "I went with my Lord Chamberlain to see a garden at Enfield town, thence to Mr. Secretary Coventry's lodge in the Chase. It is a very pretty place, the house commodious, the gardens handsome, and our entertainment very free, there being none but the Lord and myself. That which I most wondered at was, that in the compass of 25 miles, yet within 14 of London, there is not a house, barn, church, or building, besides the 3 lodges. To this lodge are 3 great ponds, and some few enclosures, the rest a solitary desert, yet stored with no less than 3,000 deer. These are pretty retreats for gentlemen, especially for those who are studious and lovers of privacy." This remoteness from civilization has always been an important characteristic of Enfield Chase, and is reflected in a number of place names, such as World's End and Botany Bay. Botany Bay is a hamlet that grew up in the middle of the chase after 1777, the name being a pun on Botany Bay in Australia, to which Captain Cook had sailed only a few years previously. The perception of the remoteness of the chase is evident in this Ordnance Survey map of 1879. I've indicated the site of Oakwood Station, which opened in 1936 with an X. Before the opening of the new station, the area was mostly free from development. South Lodge, the seat of Sir Henry Coventry, Evelyn's host, is here. The house was demolished and grounds developed as a housing estate before the outbreak of the Second World War, but you can see here an aerial photograph of South Lodge when it was in use as a school. World's End was so named because it was at the end of a track, now known as World's End Lane. It was, metaphorically speaking, the end of civilization, before you entered the wastes of Enfield Chase. It was no coincidence that the Fever Convalescent Hospital here was opened near World's End, as nobody wanted to live in close proximity to sickness and disease. This sketch, commissioned by Richard Gough in 1790, illustrates how the chase extended right up to the edge of the settlement of Enfield. The picture shows the view down from Windmill Hill towards Enfield. The tower of St Andrew's Church is on the left, and on the right is the rooftop of Enfield Manor House, which was demolished in 1928. The manor at one time served in part as a hunting lodge for the chase. We'll look at this in more detail in the next talk. This photograph is taken looking north along Gentleman's Row within the Enfield Town Conservation Area. At one time, this footpath formed the boundary to the chase, so technically the gardens on the far side of the path were encroachments onto the chase. Beyond the private gardens lies the New River Gardens and Chase Green, one of the most beautiful areas to experience the remains of the chase today. During the 1820s and early 1830s, the writers Charles and Mary Lamb lived at a number of different addresses in Gentleman's Row, starting at this house on the right, which is now called Clarendon Cottage, but was then known as Mrs. Leishman's boarding house. The choice of a new home in the countryside of Enfield Chase far from Charles's preferred haunts in London, was an intentional move for the sake of Mary's mental health. On the other side of the Chase from Enfield, this picture shows the gates onto Hadley Common at Monk and Hadley. This was the location of the gates onto the Chase. Old maps show similar gates onto the Chase at Potter's Bar, and indeed the name bar means gate. Of particular note is the iron cresset or iron fire beacon on top of the tower of Hadley Church. This was lit on particularly dark nights to provide a beacon to guide people back safely home from the Chase. This is quite possibly the oldest detailed map of the Chase. The map has a wealth of fascinating detail, and we'll look at some of that in a moment. The cartouche in the bottom left corner says, Enfield Chase as now divided between the Commonwealth and the Commons by Nicholas Gunton and Edmund Rolfe, anno 1658. The map represents the demise of the Chase as a royal hunting ground at a time when the Chase was being divided up into farms to pay the captains of Oliver Cromwell's new model army. However, it was only a couple of years later, with the restoration of the monarchy, that the Royal Chase came back into being. This close-up of part of the map shows the relationship between Enfield and the Chase. Here you can see the location of the old manor house, from which the hunters would sally forth into the Chase. To the north is the row of houses that we know today as Gentleman's Row, and a short distance away is the New River, which was constructed at the beginning of the 17th century to provide a supply of fresh water to London. Interestingly, the map also shows the pest house, located away from the settled areas to restrict the risk of disease spreading. The pest house was demolished in the early 20th century and was located at what we now know as Chase Green. Finally, the map depicts a windmill, which is where the modern Windmill Hill takes its name. This is a picture of the windmill before it was demolished, next to the fine church of St Mary Magdalene, which still stands. It was a good place for a windmill, being the highest ground in close proximity to Enfield, at over 200 feet above sea level. This section of the map, a little to the north, will be familiar to local residents, as Parsonage Lane goes by the same name today. However, the map shows that Chase Side used to be called Woodside, and that the road now called Lancaster Road was at the time called New Lane. Phipps Hatch was a simple gate onto the Chase. Hornbeam is the characteristic tree of Enfield Chase. It's a deciduous, broadleaf tree with pale grey bark. Hornbeam grows well on clay soil, which is why it's so well established on the London clays of Enfield Chase. The map shows a chapel of hornbeams, roughly in the location where Oakwood Station now stands. This section of the map is a little to the west of Enfield, in the heart of the Chase, today being the area around Trent Country Park, which the map shows was then called Noddingswell Hill. The map shows a number of ancient tracks through the Chase, which were known as ways. Today the best known of these is the Ridge Way, although now it's a busy main road. The Merry Hill Way, now better known as a popular right-of-way along the Merry Hills Brook, a little to the north, is also now a busy main road. A good idea of what the ways used to look like can be gained from the track along the southern edge of Trent Park, which was known as the Lossick Way, as shown in this photograph. The old route is shown on this modern Ordnance Survey map. Thanks for listening. That concludes this first talk. If you'd like to hear more about Enfield Chase, the next talk will be about the role and importance of hunting.